Greetings from Cal Poly State University. My name is Hunter Francis. This is part of a 6-part series on soil health with original funding from the USDA Western SARE program. Today we're going to be talking about some considerations that should be taken into account when managing nutrients, particularly in a system in which one is trying to build and protect the biology of the soil and to make better use of it. Nutrients are essential to plant life and all of our lives, but when misplaced or overused, they can create problems for us all and even problems for crops. Even worse from a business perspective is that adding supplemental nutrition to soils is expensive. While it's important to be sure that adequate nutrition is supplied, it doesn't make sense to over-apply costly nutrients that are not needed. Ideally, it's best to run a tight system in which needs are met, but nutrients are not wasted or lost through leaks in the system. A traditional way of thinking about this is what's called the mass balance approach, which refers to what is left over from added nutrients after crops have been removed. In a perfect scenario, all nutrients inputted into a system would find their place in the crops and vegetation that they were intended for. Inputs into the system are fertilizers and amendments that we're adding, but also include other potential contributors to nutrients that should be accounted for. One of the most important that is receiving increasing attention involves the fact that the soil is really a storehouse of nutrients in itself. As we've mentioned, the biota acts as a sponge and reservoir for all kinds of building blocks of life, and those include the nutrients that are essential to plant growth, like nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and so on. In a healthy system, a lot of that nutrient is comprised in the living organisms and also the organic matter. As a matter of fact, in most agricultural systems, well over 90% of the nitrogen is tied up in organic matter. Nitrogen in its mineralized form, which is usually nitrate, because ammonium in most systems is quickly converted to nitrate by microbes, is not prevalent because it is a food source for microbes that is used and incorporated into their tissues whenever they can. However, given the cycles of life and the perpetual breakdown and release of nutrients into the system, there is a steady furnishing of nutrient that is mineral. In some cases, nutrient is actually brought in from the surrounding environment, certainly in the case of carbon, brought in as carbon dioxide and turned into carbohydrates, but also in certain cases where atmospheric nitrogen is fixed by plants, such as legumes. As we mentioned, the microbiome, through its excretions, plays a big role in solubilizing nutrients like phosphorus. Therefore, it's difficult to quantify exactly, but recognition should be accorded to a certain amount of nutrient that will be mineralized from the biology and can contribute to nutrient inputted into the system. Additionally, with the help of soil testing, nutrient existing as already mineralized compounds or residual nutrients and immediately available should be counted. There are other ways that nutrients can get into the system, and this is particularly the case through irrigation water, which in some cases contains a significant amount of nutrient. As much as possible, we want the destination of the nutrients to be the crop tissue, so wherever possible it makes sense to close the leaks through which nutrients can escape, such as protecting against runoff and erosion. The release of some nutrients, in particular nitrogen, as gases is problematic. Denitrification can account for a significant loss of nitrogen from the system, particularly in anaerobic situations. Volatilization of nitrogen as ammonia is another possible leak in the system, especially when pH is alkaline. This is a schematic that was created by the California Department of Food and Agriculture that depicts these inputs and outputs in an agricultural system. There is a web link on this resource page that connects to this chart on the CDFA website. It includes a written description that further explains each of these variables. A fairly recent framework has been developed by the fertilizer industry that serves as a useful and easy-to-remember way of thinking about effective nutrient management. It's referred to as 4R and is part of a holistic way of looking at an agricultural system that seeks to balance environmental, economic, and social concerns. Wise use of resources, such as agricultural inputs, can help to meet goals in each of these three areas, whether it's environmental protection, economic savings to improve the bottom line, or socially by safer working conditions and food supply chains. The 4Rs, in this case, refer to 4 rights: right source, right rate, right time, and right place. There are many excellent resources on 4R on the links provided here, but we will take a quick look at what the 4Rs represent. Right source involves matching nutrient type to crop need. It takes into consideration factors surrounding the nature of an input, what its form is, how available it is to plants, properties and conditions that may be associated with it, and how it may react with the soils or other elements. When combining nutrients or fertility products, synergisms or negative interactions should be accounted for. All of these things should be considered in the selection of an appropriate input of fertility. Right rate is perhaps the most straightforward and a primary concern for people who are wanting to furnish crops with the correct amount of nutrient. This involves not only determining what the crop need is, but almost always involves some sort of assessment that identifies both the current nutrient status of the system and potential additions to it, as through microbial mineralization of nutrients. The balance that we spoke of refers to making sure that we strike the right equilibrium between providing enough for growth, but not too much that there is any significant loss. To determine this, we need to know what our starting point is, as well as our end goal. Testing, scouting, record keeping, and applicator calibration can all help one to achieve right rate. As plants grow, they have different needs for nutrients at different times. Clearly, a seedling is not going to need as much nutrient as a grown plant that is producing fruit. Getting a handle on right time often involves taking a look at plant uptake curves and an understanding what percentages of overall crop needs should be supplied at certain times. There's the potential for nutrient loss if too much nutrient is provided too soon, before a plant is mature enough and developing at a rate fast enough to uptake it. Synchronizing delivery with actual plant need can be assisted by controlled release technologies, which we will briefly talk about at the end of this presentation, and is a big concern when using biological amendments, as we will see in a minute. Directing the nutrient to the right place, or where exactly the nutrient is needed, usually involves trying to get the nutrients as close to the plant roots as possible. Some sort of incorporation is often helpful in this regard and helps to avoid loss by keeping nutrients in place until needed. Right placement involves considerations of nutrient delivery, how the nutrient is applied, how delivery fits into the desired tillage system. It might also involve spatial variations and field conditions within which plants are growing. Differences in soil type, slope, and irrigation, for instance, could all affect right placement. These two tables summarize the 4Rs, above by considering some of the scientific principles behind each of the 4Rs, and below by listing some of the practical options one may have in the implementation of each. Again, source refers to matching fertilizer type with crop needs and site conditions, as well as the selection of nutrients appropriate to the system. Rate is concerned with the amount of fertilizer needed as determined through testing, cost analysis, and understanding of crop requirements. Timing considers uptake dynamics at various stages of plant growth and is important to avoid unnecessary loss of fertility investments. Finally, placement deals with various applications and strategies best used to get fertilizers exactly where they are needed. Much of what we have just talked about involves planning at the farm level, but no farm operation exists in isolation, and there are other incentives and constraints that can affect decision making. At a higher level, regulatory frameworks, infrastructure, and the availability of products can be an issue. At a regional level, there may be support, or lack thereof, from the scientific community, extension, and service providers that can help assist in decision making. The idea of context is something that we've talked a lot about and means that it is hard to recommend a one-size-fits-all solution for any agricultural problem. Many of the local site factors listed here have been mentioned, and all need to be taken into account in decision making. Planning at any level ideally involves a feedback loop whereby outcomes are evaluated and considered in the next round of decision making. From an agribusiness perspective, this always involves a consideration of profitability and the economic impact of any decisions made. I'd like to point out some additional tools that are available to producers that can likewise be helpful in planning and decision making. One is a set of BMPs, or best management practices, that are included in the NRCS's Nutrient Management Practice Standard number 590. This is a fairly comprehensive list of things that should be considered for best results when applying nutrients. NRCS specialists can help growers develop a nutrient management plan using the standard, usually free of charge, although with some paperwork involved. It is also common for them to identify qualified service providers who can also assist producers with nutrient management planning, although this is normally involving a cost. Western SARE, which helped fund this series, also funded a version of the NRCS 590 standard for organic systems and is available through the Western SARE link provided on this web page. This is a very helpful resource for anyone using biologically based fertilizers and amendments, whether they are conventional or organic. It helps one to understand some of the timing and rate of release issues surrounding organic inputs, which we will be discussing in further detail shortly. For determining crop need, state extension offices normally have information that the public can access to help in decision making. In the case of California, the Department of Agriculture has a website listed below that has information for a wide variety of crops grown in the state. When one clicks on any one of the crops, one can find a range of recommendations, particularly related how best to take soil and tissue samples for that crop, and how to interpret test results for various nutrients in respect to the crop. In addition, both university and extension scientists can assist in helping to determine crop needs. These are some uptake ranges that were identified by our local extension advisors for some crops commonly grown on the central coast of California. It's interesting to note that some of the brassicas, or cole crops listed in the bottom, are heavy nitrogen feeders. They also have fairly deep rooting systems, and in fact are being used in certain cases to help scavenge nitrogen at lower depths that some of the shallow rooted crops like lettuces do not reach. This is a good way of making use of available soil nutrient that might otherwise be lost. This is a list from the International Plant Nutrition Institute, or IPNI, that was instrumental in developing the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Program. It lists the annual nitrogen contribution of common legume crops. This would be an example of a potential biological contribution of nutrient in the case where these crops might have been used as covers or as part of a rotation. For those growers who are able to use them, they can be a significant contributor to crop nutrient requirements. It should be remembered that they also bring in additional benefits beyond mineral nutrition, in particular improvement of soil structure, and like any plant, the contribution of carbon to the soil through exudates and supplemental residue. Let's take a look now at the contribution that basic soil organic matter can make to the nitrogen status of an agricultural soil. Any organic matter contained in the soil can also make a significant contribution to plant nutrition, as some of the organic components within it are mineralized. As was said in a previous video, a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 20 is often used as a cutoff point in determining whether an organic addition will create a situation of immobilization or mineralization. When there is a relatively high percentage of carbon in inputs with a CN ratio of over 20, there will be a tendency for the soil microbes to immobilize nitrogen from the soil to try to make use of the carbon sources within it. An input with under 2% nitrogen generally corresponds to this higher CN ratio. On the other hand, if an input is over 3% nitrogen and has a carbon to nitrogen ratio, of decidedly under 20, nitrogen within it will mineralize much quicker, with some nitrogen being released immediately into the soil. Setting aside the addition of a particular input, and when talking about soil organic matter in general, it might be estimated that the contribution of mineralized nitrogen during the growing season, in other words during the warmer months, would be about 2% over 60 days. At least this is the case presented by one of our extension researchers in California. An average estimate for 1 foot of soil over an area of an acre is about 4 million pounds in weight. If that's with an organic matter content of 1%, which is quite low but common for dry areas of California, that would mean that 1 acre of soil contained approximately 40,000 pounds of organic matter to the depth of a foot. The percent of nitrogen in organic matter ranges from about 3 to 7%. If we said that this soil's organic matter was at 7% nitrogen, then that would mean that there would be 2,800 pounds of nitrogen contained in the acre of soil. With 2% of that amount being mineralized over 2 months of the growing season, that would mean a release of 56 pounds of nitrogen per acre made available for plants. For a quicker growing crop, this might be half of the nutritional needs, and when accounted for, could mean a significant savings in fertility costs if harnessed. The contribution of cover crops to mineralized soil nitrogen will largely depend on their C to N ratio. Cover crops have a relatively consistent amount of carbon, but the nitrogen percentage will vary. As was just stated, if that percentage is under 2, one could expect an immobilization of nitrogen after that cover crop was incorporated into the soil. A cover crop with a nitrogen percentage of over 3, as in the case with some legumes, would result in the more immediate release of nitrogen. Microbes will be determined to eat through any carbon introduced into the system, and regardless of the crop type, they may need nitrogen to do it and will take that nitrogen from the soil. Environmental conditions need to be right in order for the microbes to do their job, however. Namely, they need moisture and some degree of warmth in order to keep their activity rates up. With appropriate moisture during the growing season, it can be expected that microbial activity will be able to mineralize about 30 to 60% of the nitrogen contained within the cover crop. The C to N ratio in any amendment is key to predicting mineralization potential. This is no different for manure and compost. Manures, especially straight manure that is not mixed with animal bedding, like straw, will tend to have a fairly low C to N ratio. Compost can vary, with yard waste and green waste from landscape trimmings, for instance, having lower nitrogen than compost made with manure, which have higher percentages of nitrogen. This graph, depicting a study done here in California, harkens back to our discussion about labile versus recalcitrant organic matter. What it shows is a release curve for 3 crops, broccoli, lettuce, and celery, of nitrogen contained within them. In all 3 cases, with broccoli releasing the most nitrogen because it contains the most nitrogen, the release rate leveled off after 4 weeks. This is because microbes first go for the easier tissues to break down. As they eat through the juicy stuff, so to speak, that is readily available, they then work at breaking down more resistant forms of carbon, thus releasing additional nitrogen at a slower rate as time progresses. Trying to pull all the pieces together that we've discussed when considering mass balance accounting type issues can be difficult because, as we've seen, there are many factors, particularly when one thinks about the complexity of biological inputs. Fortunately, there are a number of new apps and calculators that have been made available to growers to help them to estimate how these various factors combined can influence ideal rates of additional fertilizer. In California, some of our extension specialists, in particular Michael Kahn, who's pictured here, have developed an interactive calculator that helps growers to determine ideal nutrient application rates. It gives one the ability to put in different potential contributors to nutrient into the system and allows one to track inputs. This system was first developed to help track irrigation needs and schedules and can also be used for that. As far as determining what the potential contribution of some of the biologically based inputs might be over time, this was another calculator put together by Oregon State University and is also listed in our resources page here. This calculator allows one to identify the percentage of nitrogen that could be expected to be released over a given time. There are essentially 3 calculators that can be accessed through this platform, one for manure, one for finished compost, and one for cover crops. There are a variety of forms of each, and what is listed is the projected release rates over set intervals of time for different forms of these inputs. Those releases could be either positive or negative, with a positive contribution meaning that nitrogen is being liberated from them in fairly short order. In the case of higher carbon-containing materials, there could be an instance of immobilization in which nitrogen would be temporarily lost from the soil system while those materials were being degraded and thus reflected as a negative value. Ultimately, what we are getting at by such calculations is how much of the nitrogen in a given input, like a compost, is going to be made available or mineralized for plant nutrition within a reasonable amount of time, namely a growing season. That refers to what is called plant available nitrogen of an input. Additionally, and this is somewhat of a nuance, is the idea of the efficiency of the plant available nitrogen, which is the relationship between the nitrogen that will be made plant available as compared to the total nitrogen in the input. Only a portion of the total nitrogen will be made available to plants, and that availability is affected by the C/N ratio of the input. Speaking simply, a material with a lower C/N ratio will have more efficiency because a greater percentage of the total nitrogen will be made plant available. This list of some biological inputs was put together by a colleague at California Organic Fertilizers and tells what percentage of the nitrogen within them would be made available. This can have complications in terms of cost for nitrogen if one considers the efficiency of microbes in their ability to convert that nitrogen into a plant available form. This is a list of the same inputs as the last slide with varying degrees of nitrogen and how much one would end up paying per pound of nitrogen based on the cost of each material. It can be counterintuitive in some cases, but what this chart is showing is that a relatively high cost input, such as the seabird guano, could end up being a relatively cheaper source of nitrogen if the percentage of nitrogen within the input is relatively high. It has a low CN ratio, meaning that more of the nitrogen will be usable by plants within a given growing season. Since organic or biological amendments are not in the forms immediately available for plant uptake, these types of cost considerations should enter into decision-making when considering the final implications of their selection. I wanted to point out two additional things related to nutrient availability and how it can affect management decisions. The first is a trial that was conducted by Richard Smith and some of his colleagues through our extension program in California. This experiment shows the effect of incorporation of biological inputs on the release of nutrients within them. In the experiment, two types of fertilizers were placed in tea bags and then were either buried or placed on top of the soil. As one might expect in terms of nitrogen mineralization, the fertilizers that were buried and which had more exposure to the resident microorganisms in the soil released more of the nitrogen within them quicker. This chart shows that after 31 days, almost twice as much nitrogen was released by the fertilizer that had been buried as compared to the fertilizer that had remained on the top of the soil. This is an example of how placement of a fertilizer can have an impact on nutrient delivery to the plant. In more conventional systems, timing can be affected by a number of new technologies that have been developed to provide fertilizer into the system at a slower rate over time. These could be fertilizers coated with polymers or of slower solubility. Additionally, inhibitors of biological processes could be added to help slow breakdown and make fertilizers last longer within the system. Summing up, accounting and planning for nutrition involves knowing where one is starting at, what the crops will need, and what options are in terms of ways to getting nutrients to the plant. Testing at the outset should determine whether there is any residual plant available nitrogen nutrient existing in the system, what additional nutrient could be supplied by organic matter within the system, and whether there are any special circumstances such as environmental factors like weather or the chemistry of a soil that could impede nutrient delivery and uptake. In understanding the amount of nutrient needed by a crop, one should consider when exactly during the growth cycle that nutrient will be needed. In considering options for supplying added nutrient, one should consider what the best forms of nutrient might be, how they might react with other inputs, where it should be placed, in the case of biologics, how quickly that nutrient will be made available, and importantly, how much nutrient might be made available through irrigation.